Hi, I'm Suskin. Welcome to my world. You know, I work mostly as an astrologer. And as an astrologer, I not only get to see what concerns people at the moment, both in general in terms of the world and their own individual matters, but I also get to gain a lot of insight into not only the human condition as it stands right now, but also the way that we understand ourselves and the way that we've understood ourselves for generations upon generations. Astrology is literally thousands of years old. And while people mostly think of it as a system of divination or as a way of describing karma, all of those things which it's good at, making predictions, stuff like that, the whole structure of astrology is a model of ourselves in this great big cosmos that we found ourselves in. And as a model, it is a model of human behavior. And even though it's thousands of years old, as we know from the great Greek dramatists and the great philosophers and the history of the world, the human being doesn't change so much. The human experience changes with our technologies and our history, but the human being and our psychology, our psyches, stay pretty much the same. So by looking at how astrology understands ourselves, we can actually gain a great deal of insight into what it means to be a human being. So looking at how astrology models the human being, human behavior, the human mind, we can gain a great deal of insight into ourselves, especially because of one of the most amazing characteristics of that model. Astrology's model of the human being is an integral, holistic model that connects us to everything in our cosmos, connects us to everything in our lives around us, and also connects different parts of ourselves, shows us that there's certain aspects of ourselves that are related even when it's not obvious. Most of the time it is obvious. We live this human experience and we know that. But because astrology is a practical model that allows us to work with that, it can actually give us some insights into what to do about these things. So what is the thing I'm talking about today? Well, it is what I think is the grand malaise of contemporary times. Most astrologers would agree with me. I'd imagine that most psychologists would agree with me, because the bottom line is that there is an enormous pandemic of poor self-worth. How is it that in a world that we are able to achieve so much, where we have greater freedom than human beings have had most of the time in history, and greater freedom to pursue our own goals and measure ourselves by our own standards, how is it that we suffer more from not being able to value ourselves correctly, from poor self-worth, poor self-esteem, as it is often called, than apparently anyone in our history? Certainly, self-esteem issues are the issues of our age. So why? How can we relate that to anything, and what can we do about it? That's what I want to address from my astrological point of view. Well, the first thing astrology does is that it always says which category of things does an experience in our lives belong to. And self-esteem, like everything else belonging to the self, in astrology fits into the category of the things that I own, that belong to me, that are closest to me, that emerge from what I do, or that I depend on because they're so close to me. So the classical idea of those things is my physical possessions and my money. Interestingly, in astrology, it's also the things that I say that fall into that category. So category number one in astrology is me and my body and myself. And category number two in astrology is that which is mine and that which pertains or comes directly from me. So it's my money, my voice, it's those kinds of things. Well, we immediately gain insight by understanding the simple premise that astrology says self-esteem is related to what I have. It's not so surprising in the pretty much capitalist world that we operate, where we measure so much by money, but it's not necessarily about money per se. It's about my capacity to earn money. It's about how much I get paid and whether or not that relates to how valuable I think my job is. And most people, let's face it, don't stand up and assert, I demand more money, I'm doing a great job. Occasionally we manage to do that. But we get stuck into this trap of, on the one hand, I don't know how to value myself. And on the other hand, I don't have enough money, or I don't get paid enough, or the money slips through my fingers. So therefore, obviously, maybe I'm not worth that much. There is a link between money and worth, because in our culture, money is a number by which we measure worth. Now, I don't want to get too caught into the money part of it, but it is a very important starting point for many of us. If you ask yourself the basic question, do I think I earn what I'm worth? Do I think I'm getting paid what I'm worth? Many of you will find that there is a little bit of a sore point that arises somewhere deep inside of you. If you think that you're not getting paid what you're worth, then that's a great start, because then you know you're worth more. But if you don't really engage with that money issue and find yourself struggling with money always, astrologers would ask, well, is it a self-worth issue? So much so that often in astrology we can see that the reason why people have financial problems is that they push money away from themselves because they don't think they deserve it. Pushing money away from yourself is things like not asking for a raise, undercharging, not collecting when people don't pay. Very common problems, especially in the world where people are self-employed. Like in my job, where I'm self-employed as an astrologer, there isn't some objective standard by which I can measure the value of my work, because our culture and our society doesn't recognize the value of astrology very much. But there are many things that go along with that, and many things which are the stuff that people do themselves and as entrepreneurs. So if people are not charging enough, it really reflects on how they think about that work that they're offering. What I say to, be it other astrologers or massage therapists, aromatherapists, counselors in more informal forms of counseling, or where people provide a service like mine, which is not valued by the world outside, where you have to decide for yourself its value. The most common thing is not charging enough. The most common thing with beginners or newcomers to a field is, well, I'll charge less because I'm not very good at it, or I'm not very experienced at it. And the end result of that problem is that you undermine the value of what you do. If you are not charging enough for what you do, or if you are not collecting on people who owe you money, then you are telling the world what I do is not worth very much. In fact, if you, because you're a beginner, or you don't see a qualification on your wall, or because you don't know how to value yourself, and so you charge less. And if you charge less than everyone else for the same job that they're doing as well, and you think, oh, well, it's because they're more experienced and they're professionals, and so you're charging less. Well, your clients and your customers don't know that. So they see you charging 150 Rand or dollars for what everyone else is charging 500 for, and they either think, well, everyone else is a rip-off, and or they think the thing that you offer isn't worth very much. So you need to understand that sometimes, perhaps often, by undermining your own value, you undermine the values of other people. And understanding that is a great way to kind of get a grip on yourself and realize, I can't mess with the whole value system. If I charge too little for my readings, I'm telling everyone they're not worth very much. I'm telling everyone that other astrologers are overcharging them. And I'm creating this problem for other astrologers and astrology by saying it isn't worth as much as the numbers that they're telling you. So a good way to catch yourself in the mirror is to say, let me not mess with other people's value systems. Let me not mess with the value system of my profession or my world that I find myself in, and look at this another way. Well, the psychologist Heidi Halvorson says that there is another way to look at self-worth issues. In fact, that even research shows that the way to address ourselves is with compassion, that the missing link in the way that we understand ourselves is self-compassion. Literally, we judge ourselves too harshly. So in failing to have any kindness or understanding of ourselves, we are expecting ourselves to be some kind of ideal human being or perfect human being. Well, cultivating compassion for others is something that we give a lot of attention to, but we fail to do so for ourselves. So it's not so surprising that that is our problem, because we live in a world where we easily judge, and we easily judge others. Why? Because we strive for perfection. Having freed ourselves from the superstitions of medieval times, from class systems, often from beliefs in karma and the soul. Not all of us, hopefully not all of us watching today, but having freed ourselves of a lot of those things that kind of predefined us from the world, we've got this idea that, okay, we're capable of anything, and that I can achieve my best. If I persist, I will eventually achieve the absolute best possible. So we are expecting ourselves to be absolutely perfect, or at least to be more perfect and more perfect, and I could do this better. There certainly is no harm in striving towards perfection, but we need to look very carefully how we do that. So this is what I always like to remember. Perfect is not a possible state. Because the world continues to change and move all the time, because life changes, grows, things move on, everything in the world seeks entropy. Nothing is standing still. Nothing is standing still. I'm sure we can all agree on that. So then my question is that if you achieved perfection today, what would you have tomorrow? If everything keeps on going, well, you can't have more perfect tomorrow, because perfect is the end of the line. So the only possibility is that tomorrow it starts falling apart and complications start arising. It's a really good way to keep yourself in check. Find yourself striving for perfection. Say, whoa, if I had perfection, I'll have decay tomorrow. So let me always be working towards perfection, but never expecting to achieve it, because I'll achieve it at some end point, the day I die. So I ain't in a rush to get there. Let me rewind myself back to the present and say I'm always striving towards perfection, but I'm never getting there. So I don't expect myself to be perfect. I just expect myself to always be working at getting better. I never have to judge myself by saying that's not good enough. I can rather say, well, it'll be a little bit better tomorrow and a little bit better the next day. And if I'm always on this idea of I'm working towards the perfection, it's much more difficult for me to judge myself. But compassion is still required. So step number one is understanding that perfection is an end point I only want at the end of my life, so I can always work towards it. And then looking at yourself with compassion. Halvorsen says, when you are self-compassionate in the face of difficulty, you neither judge yourself harshly nor feel the need to defensively focus on all your awesome qualities to protect your ego. Well, that's a very powerful statement, because we also live in a culture that says, celebrate your awesomeness, be awesome all the time. I mean, I was even thinking, as I was talking about this world where self-worth is an issue, we also have perhaps a younger generation, but not exclusively a younger generation, that is tremendously focused on I'm fabulous. The selfies and the Snapchats and the focus around our own world. YouTube, here's me. But that focus around ourselves that our culture has turned into asks us or requires us to boost your ego and say I'm awesome, and this is why you want to hear me, and this is what I'm great at, and this is what I had for dinner, all of those kind of things. I'm awesome, I'm awesome, I'm awesome. Even the culture of every child gets a merit, there isn't a winner. And we see that all the time, that we've changed this idea of there's a winner and there's someone who has to win next time, and everyone wins because everyone's awesome. And in our efforts to deal with a self-worth issue that way, we've created a bigger problem for ourselves, because, as Halvorsen says, it is defensive to focus on our awesome qualities to protect the ego. And the ego is half the problem. because the ego depends on a feeling of self-worth from outside sources all the time. The ego is waiting to hear you're fabulous, and it's coming from outside. So that's where we need to take a step back and have self-compassion. As Halvorsen goes on to say, studies actually show that people who practice self-compassion have greater levels of well-being, optimism, and happiness, and less anxiety and depression. So how do we practice self-compassion? Well, there's another psychologist by the name of Leon Seltzer who says that, well, one of the reasons why we have difficulty measuring our self-esteem and difficulty accepting ourselves is because we originally learned that we are judged by other standards. We originally learned to be judged by others. And so we're always trying to please our parents from when we're young, and please our teachers, and please everyone else. So we've always got this idea, I have to do better, I'd better be good at, I need to be perfect, all of those kind of things. And in some kind of way, we've always sought approval. And he says the quest for self-worth is often a quest for the approval from others, just like what we just thought about, as the ego is looking for affirmation all the time. So that is the looking for approval. So we need to tell ourselves, rewind back to ourselves, that firstly, I am the standard by which I judge myself. I no longer require my parents or my teachers or someone else to tell me how fantastic I am. It's now all up to me, and it's all about how I judge myself. So he says that in order to become more self-accepting, we need to keep acknowledging what we have done. Keep on examining feelings of guilt and how guilt arises out of that expectation from someone else. I'm going to refer you back to episode 15 here on rodTV on YouTube to learn more about the whole issue of guilt and sacrifice over there. But we need to find ourselves criticizing ourselves or putting ourselves down and ask ourselves, what is it that I don't accept about myself? Ask yourself that question directly, and you kind of bust yourself a little bit, because then you're forced to look at it from a different point of view. What don't I accept about ourselves? And then we can work on accepting ourselves more fully. And accepting ourselves is, like I was saying earlier on, acknowledging that everything I'm doing today is fine, I'm doing better all the time. Accepting ourselves means, okay, well, I am a professional. They gave me the degree or the diploma. I might not have the 20 years of experience that the next person has, but I'm recognized as fully capable of doing this job. You need to start with accepting yourself and look at where are those feelings of guilt, etc., coming from. He says that in order to become more self-accepting, you need to appreciate that you're not responsible for a lot of who you are. You start off with a lot of biology, genetics, upbringing, teaching from teachers, all of those kind of things. He says most of your actions have been compelled by some combination of background and biology. That's Leon Seltzer. Now that doesn't excuse you. It becomes your starting point. While biology might continue to play a role through your genes or whatever, the starting point is to say, having accepted that, now I can become conscious. Now I can work on self-acceptance, measuring myself by my own standards, not seeking perfection, and learning to be compassionate on myself. Because I do my best, I inherit all this biology, and I'm working from that point of view, developing self-compassion. If we don't accept ourselves, we're not going to be compassionate on ourselves. So remember, there is also that question of self-acceptance. So one of the issues of self-acceptance is that it's often conditional. It often says, when I do something, I'll be fine. And so self-acceptance must also be oriented towards the present, not the future. Learn to catch yourself looking towards the future when saying, it will be okay and I will be okay. And start on working on, well, how am I okay now? What am I doing now that helps me get there? Not is fantastic and done. Because if you keep on looking for an end result, you're looking for perfection, you're never going to get there. So don't tell yourself that about the future. Tell yourself that about the present. And without any qualifications, I am okay. I'm okay because I'm conscious and I'm focusing on this and I'm working on it. Full stop. I can accept myself because I'm not burying in my head in the sand and I'm not saying it's all biology, nothing I can do. I'm working from that point, and every single day allows me to accept myself because I am being conscious. The final step in that is to learn to break the habit of continually evaluating yourself. Everything I've said so far, the steps along the way are about learning to evaluate yourself differently, learning to evaluate yourself in the present, learning to appreciate what you are and what you do. But finally, in the end, we must learn to start breaking that habit. Stop seeking to measure ourselves, assess ourselves, reassess ourselves, impose guilt on ourselves, and having to forgive ourselves. Although we have to start off today by forgiving ourselves, we have to start off in order to reach towards self-worth by forgiving ourselves. In the end, we want to break that habit completely and say, I don't need to forgive myself and I don't need to assess myself. Here I am in the now, alive and well and doing my thing. I'm okay. It might be a little bit easier said than done, but it is a daily practice of self-acceptance and self-compassion that will get us to that point of realizing, actually, I'm all right. There can be crises and traumas going on in my life. There can be things hanging over my head, but actually, I'm all right. And learning to start from there and learning to measure from that is what makes us all right. So in the end, self-acceptance is about living in the present and being in the present and not measuring your self-worth by external standards, even money, which is where we started. We started off by saying money is the number by which we measure the worth of things, but it is not the number by which I measure the worth of myself. So once you've learned to master the worth of your thing, the worth of the service that you offer to the world, and you are charging appropriately, and you are collecting from people who haven't paid, then you can say, that thing is worth the $500. But that's not related to what I'm worth. My value comes out of being me here now. The road starts with that self-acceptance and self-compassion. There are little tips that people often give that can be really helpful about enhancing your stronger sense of self and self-worth. And that is basically achieving small things every day. So the simplest route to help you get there is also to remember to acknowledge every little thing that you do every day that gets you somewhere. Do a small chore once a day. When you get to the end of the day and the to-do list is not done, put it aside and say, no one's going to die before tomorrow. If I don't send that email tonight, everyone will still be there tomorrow, as critical as it seems to be. And learning to say, I'm fine the way I am doing it. Every one little thing creates the increase of self-esteem. And once we learn to depend on ourselves, not the past, not the parents, not the money, not the job itself, but all upon I'm okay by my own standards, we will break the self-worth problem and we will own ourselves. The starting point was astrology says category number 1 is me and category number 2 is what is mine. Well, what is mine, ultimately, the greatest value of all is myself. That's where we need to work towards. So, still time for one question, and I have a question from Renee. And Renee says, I have an opportunity to travel overseas in July to advance my career, but it's going to be extremely expensive. Will it be worth it? Will it advance my career? Well, Renee, the chart completely agrees that this is going to be a little bit of a costly exercise. So, indeed, that is a daunting fact. But the chart does show, firstly, it's a great time to travel. If I was looking at this without you and doing a prediction, I'd even just look at the chart and say, oh, she's traveling in July. That is, to me, a clear yes. But much more importantly, I looked a little bit further, and your chart shows that while it will be expensive, and at first you might have to kind of manage that expense, sustain that expense for a while. By the time we get to October, November, you'll completely see why it was worth it, and that will probably even reflect in an improvement in your finances. So go for it, bite the bullet for a little while, pays off, but before the end of the year. Remember, if you have a personal question about anything you need to know the outcome of, especially if it's in the near future, or any kind of question really, drop me a line at this email address over here. Don't forget, visit my website where you can also send your question, fill out the question form, and make sure I get all the correct details, and look out for the answer on the next episode or a subsequent episode here on rodTV. So remember, share this with your friends, tell them about it, come to YouTube, and be here again next Friday at noon for another episode. See you then.